Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Rethinking Residencies Symposium. Hi, I'm Carrie. Thank you all for attending and welcome on behalf of the Valiz Center for Art and Politics and Rethinking Residencies. And thank you to New York State Council on the Arts for being the major funder of this symposium. Founded in 2014, Rethinking Residencies is the first network of New York-based artist and curator residency programs, and its members are Abrams Art Center, I-Beam, Fire Island Artist Residency, Flux Factory, International Studio and Curatorial Program, Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, Queens Museum, Pioneer Works, Recess, Shandaken Projects, EFA Project Spaces Shift Residency, Triangle, Wave Farm, Wave Hill, and WOW Project. Yesterday, we held a keynote conversation between trailblazing artists Marilada Ranucales and Tanya Candiani, who shared their wisdom with us about residencies and their own residency experiences. Their exchange exemplified how different residencies can be in both their aims and forms. Today, we will begin with a solo lecture by Irmeli Kokko, followed by a panel on representation, accountability, and solidarity in institutions and the artists they serve. That will feature M. Carmen Lane from the ATNSC Center for Healing and Creative Leadership in Cleveland, Francesca Massoera from La 18 in Marrakesh, Emily Jassir from Dar Jassir in Bethlehem, and Emily Pethick from the Rijks Academy in Amsterdam. I'm excited to learn from these 4 colleagues who run residencies that range in size. They're small, they're large. They also range in their histories. Some were founded in the last few years and the Rijks Academy more than 100 years ago, and so on. Again, pointing to the diversity of this field. I've had a preview of some of the presentations today, and I'm certain that together our ideas about residencies will be expanded and challenged. The symposium is being held in English, and there will be American Sign Language and closed captioning, which you should see now. The closed captioning you can turn on at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And thank you to our interpreters for today. Please participate in the chat. We want to hear from you. Ask questions in the Q&A, make comments in the chat, and please send us your follow-up emails if you like at info@rethinkingresidencies.org. The response to this symposium has been overwhelming, and many of you have asked about documentation. Each session of the Rethinking Residencies Symposium will be online in January 2022, free for all to access. You can check rethinkingresidencies.org and the Valiz for this video documentation. A free digital publication based on the symposium will be launched in June 2022, and you can find it on the Rethinking Residencies website then. So now I would like to warmly introduce Irmeli Kokko, who will be delivering a solo lecture on the history of artist residencies, beginning in the late 19th century with artist colonies until today. Irmeli co-edited the most comprehensive book on residencies to date, 2019 Contemporary Artist Residencies, Reclaiming Time and Space, published by Valiz. And it's a book that's been a significant resource for the residency field and a constant reference for our discussions in Rethinking Residencies. So thank you, Irmeli, for this really important contribution to the field. Irmeli's been a leader in residencies since the 1990s, and she's held many institutional positions in Finland, where she is based in Helsinki, including as the founder and director of the Helsinki International Artist Program, HIAT. You can see her full bio online if you'd like to read more. So please put questions in the Q&A during Irmeli's talk as soon as you have them. Don't wait, because right after she finishes her talk, we'll go straight to audience questions, which I'm very excited to hear. So thank you, Irmeli, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be with you. And thank you, Kari, for the invitation and the Rethinking Residency Network and the Valiz Center. And also the artist who spoke yesterday, thank you for, it was a really, really wonderful to listen to you. My title is A Brief History of Artist Residencies, and it has three parts. The first one is called Changing Art Practices and the Wave of New Artist Residencies. The second is called Artist Mobility, a pendulum between rural and urban. And three is called Contemporary Artist Residencies, Reclaiming Time and Space. Before I start the actual presentation about the past or the recent past, just to lead you to why I started to do this. My story of the recent history of artist residencies has been affected by work with artist residencies from the mid-90s on, and within arts management and in practical activities at the HIAP Helsinki International Artist Program. From the start, when I started to know residencies in around 94, I got immediately interested in the artist residencies as a phenomenon. I began to seek out and read related literature, theories of cultural globalization, cultural history of mobility, cosmopolitan movements, and so on. Meanwhile, the global residency movement expanded powerfully. Res Artis, the international network for residency organizations, was founded in 1994, and I took part in its meetings for the first time in 1996. Res Artis member organizations later on offered me the material for my study on residencies, which I completed in 2008. The study examined residency activities from the point of view of art history, cultural policy, and cultural production. At that time, literature on artist residencies did not exist, so the symposiums, meetings, or conferences that I attended also led to the emergence of materials, documents, and articles. At the same time, I met people who had long been working with artist residencies and spoken and written about them, people such as Jean-Baptiste Joly or Ika Sienkiewicz-Nowacka or Gordon Knox. All these meeting and discussing with people, and then my own research trying to go deeper to the phenomenon, it reinforced my view that although the roots of the 1990s artist residencies are in the tradition of artist travels and artist communities, cultural globalization and the practices of modern art had turned them into something new. Then in 2018, Taru Elfin, Pascal Hielen, and myself started planning a compilation of articles about residencies that got the title Contemporary Artist Residencies, Reclaiming Time and Space. I will go back to that later on in the presentation. Part 1, Changing Art Practices and the Wave of New Artist Residencies. In the early 1990s, artist residencies as a method and formula seemed to correspond to many institutional utopias, creating art on site, experimentation, and artist international mobility and interaction, all in the spirit of the famous Black Mountain College. Artist residencies made it possible for artists to travel and work beyond the Western map of art to new continents. In the residencies, different cultures met at a personal level. It seemed that this renaissance through residencies would be one of the best achievements of the globalization process. Moreover, it also emerged in an unplanned fashion, like a grassroots movement without guidance from governments. In the 1970s and 80s, artist residencies were seen as houses, communities of studios and apartments where artists could retire to make art for a specific period. By the way, I want to add that my point of view is in the Northern Hemisphere, and also that I speak much in a European orientation. So to make myself clear. Martta Jaukkuri, who was the first head of the Nordic Art Center in Helsinki in 1980s, has described how much effort went into keeping exhibition operations and guest studio operations separate from each other. The traditional operating model for artist residencies was based on the approach where the studio is a private workspace that provided the framework, time, and space for artistic creation without connection to the audience. Then in 1995, the first hefty phone book-sized residency catalogue, a guide of host facilities for artists on short-term stay in the world, was published in France. For the guidebook, a 2-year survey was coordinated to identify and list venues for creative work with a new spirit. Around 200 residency organizations from 29 countries and 5 networks were listed and included in the guide. The selection criteria were based on the founding texts of a range of existing organizations that had adopted a certain kind of ethos to provide workspace for research and experimentation and to encourage creative activities, to create new contacts either with other artists or with a specific environment. Openness and access to artists of all nationalities was also a fundamental criterion for the guide. The residencies representing the new spirit were seen to foster exchanges, encounters, and even confrontation. Artist residencies were seen as arenas in which the unpredicted could materialize, and as studios to embody art in transition, not necessarily the gestation of the work itself, from an object of art to the presence of the artist. Connections between residency activities and other actors of modern art have become closer since the 1990s. Before that, residency activities lived their own lives mainly outside the institutional art system as artistic communities, artist houses, studio complexes, or activities of private patrons of the arts. Mi-Won Kwon has said that the huge growth of the number of new residencies in the 1990s relates to the increase in art practices based on travel in the production of art. According to Claire Doherty, artistic practices tied to location and the traditions of residency as hosting organizations found each other in the 90s. New discourses were adopted in the residency activities, and their programs were remolded to correspond to practices of contemporary art. According to Charlotte Büdler, international residency programs from the late 1980s were designed to offer a ready-made infrastructure for the needs of increased international mobility and work. These interpretations might be true, but they described residency activities from an instrumental angle, ignoring the traditions, intentions, and values arising from the starting points of residency activities themselves. Second part, artist mobility, a pendulum between rural and urban. In many cases, conventions in the arts are transformed by the artists themselves, either as a reaction to the existing working conditions or actively through means aimed at modifying the structures of art production. In fact, changes in residency operations can be considered in relation to their own tradition of artist communities. No consistent reports are available on the background and history of artist residencies. However, articles, lecture documents, and art history studies do exist concerning the artist colonies of the 19th and 20th centuries and the history, the avant-garde movements and artist communities. When outlining the evolution of residency operation step by step from the 19th century on, there seems to be first a shift away from urban society and then a shift back to the cities in the 20th century. This pendular motion involves changes and transitions, such as the Industrial Revolution, when artists flocked to the countryside seeking better conditions for creating art. The situation was in the, especially when it started from the Great Britain, and where the Industrial Revolution was highly, the cities in England were highly polluted, and also the dirt and the air to breathe was really thick, and also the poverty and how the revolution kind of divided the society into even children and adults with much poverty, and then the whole society was impacted on that. So artists felt that this kind of environment is not proper for creating art, so they headed to the countryside, which they felt was pure. So when artists flocked to the countryside seeking better conditions for creating art, however, the First World War forced artists to take refuge in the cities, often forming new artist communities. Others sought to form better intellectual and productive conditions for creating art, which often involved artist communities. Artist colonies in the 19th and 20th century. In the United States, in the 1880s, artists, authors, and scientists discovered the nature and Native American culture of New Mexico, Taos, and Santa Fe, which was on the verge of extinction. The artist colonies of Santa Fe and Taos represented communities created by the location and its culture, and the appeal of these communities encouraged artists of different fields, visual artists, writers, and researchers from many countries to travel there to investigate and document the disappearing way of life, religions, and arts of the local Pueblo people. All were impressed by the spirit of the place, as D.H. Lawrence expressed it. Also, the Finnish artist Akseli Kallen-Kallela worked in the colonies of Taos and Santa Fe for 3 years. The MacDowell colony was the first artist colony in the United States to be founded in an organized manner. Inspired by the American Academy in Rome, it was established in 1907 by composer Edward MacDowell and his wife Maria MacDowell on a farm in New Hampshire. After the death of her husband, Maria MacDowell had 32 artist studios built near the farm. The colony still has the same task. The colony, and this is a quotation, the colony mission today, as it was then, is to nurture the arts by offering creative individuals of the highest talent and an inspiring environment in which to produce enduring works of the imagination. Can I have image 1, please? In her book, Rural Artist Colonies in Europe, 1870 to 1910, Nina Lubred writes about the scene of artists moving from cities to rural colonies in Central Europe. A total of about 3,000 artists retired as a mass movement for different periods of time to establish artist communities in rural areas, mainly in France, Central Germany, and the Netherlands, but also in Hungary and the Baltic Sea region. Rural nostalgia as a reaction to urbanization and industrialization formed the ideological framework for artist villages in the countryside. The idea of creating new sensory experiences of nature was a central artistic agenda in the colony projects. The experience of surrender to the countryside and being immersed in the sights, colors, sounds, smells, and details of nature led artists to develop their own brand of plain art painting. New innovations, such as studio moving on wheels and landscape painting methods which preceded Impressionism, were developed in the colonies. In paintings, a new unfocused, immediate foreground appeared, whose idea was to lead the gaze of the viewers to a sensual experience of nature, to admiration and amazement. The colonies themselves ranged in size from a few dozen artists to over 500. There were both international and national artist villages. Artist mobility from colony to colony varied. There were artists who resided permanently in a colony, others lived and worked in a colony for a specific period, and there were those who moved like nomads from one colony to another. When shifting from the early modern era to the modern era of urban Bohemian artists in the early 20th century, artist villages remained in place. But the rebellious role adopted by urban Bohemian artists was not suited to the peaceful rural villages. After the First World War, rural artist colonies lost most of their significance from the perspective of art production, and the remaining villages became destinations for cultural tourism. You can take the image away, please. In the 20th century, the Blaureiter, the Style, Cubism, futuristic movements in Italy and Russia, Dadaism in Zurich, Surrealism in Paris, Russian avant-garde and constructivism, as well as the Bauhaus in Weimar, created new aesthetical and political concepts. Artist communities, art production methods, and works of art. For example, constructivism in Russia turned art into production art, and the artist became a production artist, and studios turned into laboratories. Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus School as a new model of academic artist education. Bauhaus was surrounded by an international artist community, workshops across different forms of art, and practical and theoretical artist education. In the first 3 decades of the 20th century, international urban artist communities represented intellectual homes across national and language boundaries in a Europe that was dominated by anti-Semitism, nationalism, restricted mobility, and patriarchal power. Then, as a result of the Second World War, many European artists and intellectuals fled to New York. New forms of educational and collaborative production emerged, for example, in Black Mountain College, the Summer Art Institutes between the years 1941 and 1957. During the summer courses in the 1950s, visual artists, composers, authors, and dancers of the American avant-garde created the optimal model for an artist community and collaborative artistic work. The focus of the operation was outside the institutional system, but they redefined the conventions and content of art. The summer schools of Black Mountain upgraded the idea of artist colonies as rural retreats into collective laboratories for experimental art. Keywords at Black Mountain College were experimentation and experience, transcultural awareness, and collaboration were the basic positions. Openness to failure and chance was seen as a precondition for experimentation. Moving from object to process-based thinking, where the artist presence becomes an important part of both making and presenting art, living and working together for different periods of time in temporary communities, are all part of the legacy of Black Mountain College, not only in artist education, but also in artist residencies. I'm not suggesting that the residencies of the 1980s or 1990s would have directly adopted the goals and methods of Black Mountain College for themselves. However, BMC might have served as a projection surface for many new residencies against which they could envision their activities. Artist communities of the 20th century were social, political, and productive communities for art innovations. The ideological background of artist residencies was initially related to the industrial transition and the reaction against it, which took the form of artists moving from cities to rural areas. Cosmopolitan artist communities of modernism and the avant-garde headed to the cities. Image 2, please. Artist residencies formed a versatile global platform already in the early 21st century, in which artists from different fields traveled, worked, and spent time in different cultural and geographical environments, cities and rural areas. At present, artist residencies form their own art world in the ecosystem of contemporary art. Residencies have their own institutional identity, their own history, their own operating methods, values, tasks, and goals. Both on national level and at the EU level, cultural policy saw mobility to be a significant boost to employment among artists, interaction between cultures, and the art market in general. Generally speaking, the goals of the UNESCO Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity. When Taru Elfing, Pascal Hieland, and I began to plan the Contemporary Artist Residencies Reclaiming Time and Space article collection in 2018, We were living in a neoliberal world in which the production and reception of art and culture was part of a growing, accelerating cultural industries. At the same time, the 1990s optimism of the globalization process of culture appears to have reached a saturation point of sorts. Accelerated climate change, ethical questions on cultures and natural diversity, post-colonial points of view in cultural production, the refugee issue and protectionist movements confronted residencies with new questions. Questions were being raised about artistic work and images of an traveling-based artist from the and even asked about the conditions of creative work. One artist asked that, is it necessary to travel beyond your own country to be able to create a new artwork? Also, new residency programs were established again. They started to kind of a new movement to remote locations, wildernesses and villages. Often they were established by artists themselves. The direction shifted from cities toward nature and slower rhythms. This all was reflected in interviews with artists conducted for the planning of the book and in the articles of the writers. A crossroads of sorts was approaching. How could time and space be secured in this time for a creative process, for immersion, for encounters among artists across national borders and between continents, and for sustainable aesthetic intellectual exchange, so that residencies do not turn into just one more cog in an accelerated cultural industry machine. When everything stopped in 2020, residencies based on the presence of the artist sharing creative work and discussions among other artists were no longer possible. Generosity of the artist residencies and the outcomes got silent. Now the future developments remain unknown. A state of uncertainty and discontinuity prevails, which is general and applies to everyone. Social researchers pondering the world after the pandemic say that now is the right time to consider possible futures and think about what kind of a world we want to build. For artist residencies, this could mean considering what kinds of international centers of art and creativity we want to build and what kind of futures we can imagine for residency activities. Now I would like to ask the image number 3. At the same time, new networks are being born among new artist residencies. This is called the NARCA map, and this is a Nordic alliance of artist residencies of climate actions. Climate action of a 3-year project, a very, very new, that was established and founded at the Glasgow Climate Change Conference in 2021. NARCA is a long-term and resilient contact and collaborative project between Scotland and the Nordic countries focused on the climate crisis. Its focus is in Arctic region. Well, okay, I conclude. Thank you for your attention. This is all.
Thank you. so much, Irmeli, for that talk. It encompassed a really, comprehensive history of artist residencies, and one that has a lot left to be written, as we know. And I encourage everyone to get a copy of Reclaiming Time and Space. There was a question while you were speaking about whether or not these references would be listed somewhere, and I encourage the attendee to get a copy of the book, because I think there's a bibliography in there and many references that you refer to. We're going to go to some questions, and the first question is, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, as you mentioned, there was an increase in rural residencies as a reaction to urbanization. Regarding the current proliferation of rural residencies that you mentioned, can you elaborate on why this may be happening and how you envision this post-COVID? So more succinctly, the question is, there was a move to rural residencies, then to urban, now back to rural. So how do you think about this transformation? Irmeli, we can't.
Oh, sorry.
We hear you now. Okay.
At least in the Nordic regions, many artists they somehow experience the working on the conditions of art markets to be too heavy for them and too hectic. And they more kind of wanted to go to places or to establish or find ways to slow it down, to make art and to concentrate and to go deeper to their own production, and also connected to the climate crisis. The awareness of the climate crisis has really affected artists really much in the region. Many new residencies have their programs on kind of ecological issues and in their program. So this might be the one reason, but also I think that there is also the curiosity to the unknown regions of the north, and to areas where there are no organizations of art, and to do something else, to do something new to unknown regions, because of the many places like the Mustarinda, which in Finland, it started in 2015, something like that. It's a group of artists who bought a house which is really in the middle of a forest, which is an old forest, and their whole programming is about building up a new relationship to nature.
Mm-hmm. Tomorrow, Mustarinda will be in our 2 o'clock panel, so we'll get to hear more about their program, which is really fascinating. I'm looking forward to that. And I think, generally speaking, the Nordic countries are thinking in a way that's much more forward-looking around not just environmental sustainability, but also how residencies can be more sustainable, because there's a lot of questions around travel and going to places for short periods of time, and you cover some of that in the book. And I think that's a really key question for residencies moving forward. I mean, all art institutions in the whole world, but particularly residencies, which are, in the vein of institutions that bring people places.
Yeah, maybe I didn't mention so much on the recent history that the periods of residencies were understood many times to be kind of a certain period of time, that it's not an artist residencies if it's not a certain period of time, which would be at least 3 months. And I think that it has become a kind of gauge of a frame that is difficult to go beyond. But anyway, there are residency programs who have started to listen to artists more than the mission, or the kind of the normative mission or the conventional mission of residencies. This is like the Waiting Artists Art Center in Britain, whose program was shifted and opened in a new way when they took artists to be part of the curatorial processes. And what it led to kind of both to shorter periods of time, which were like workshops, short workshops together with like 10, 20 artists. And then there were longer periods. So it was more concentrated on production and then learning. That was the kind of what the artists' needs seem to be.
There's we have another question. The 1980s, 2000s, which you mentioned, efforts to make residencies separate from the exhibition activities of institutions. Can you think of any examples of institutions where residencies and exhibitions hold equal weight? Or what is most important for institutions to consider in terms of having a hybrid program? So in other words, you know, in my perspective, the question...
I believe that each period of time has their own needs. And I think that before there was a certain kind of need to keep them separate from each other. But now I feel that it would be really a kind of time to open residencies for audiences and the communities more, and to find ways to not to keep them separate, but on the contrary, to have more connections and partnerships with not only with other art institutions like, you know, museums, but also with other sectors, with education, with health, with science. Residencies are such an incredibly flexible model of working, so they can in fact connect to many ways to the rest of the society.
Right. Next question. What forces gave rise to the contemporary trend of governments funding their citizen artists' travel to residencies internationally? So, this is an interesting question that we've spoken about before. Also,
I think it was connected, at least in Europe, but I think it was also globally connected to two things. First of all, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of Berlin, Mauer, and the Berlin Wall, and then also which as a consequence, all the borders were suddenly open. It's difficult to imagine how it was in the late 80s and 90s, that the traveling and mobility was really it was controlled, and it wasn't a kind of necessarily self-clear that artists can work anywhere they wish to work or where they are invited. It was slower, more difficult, and also guided by the governments. So this changed the situation, and of course then globalization process itself, that which meant the free mobility of capital and people and things, and is of course kind of the big background force of the mobility of also in art. I think it's amazing what this pandemic shows, how dependent on we are on the structures. And in a way, this Zygmunt Bauman discusses about the flat world, the mobility in liquid modernity, as a kind of flat world where there are no hierarchies and there are no states and borders. And suddenly the pandemic raised up the walls again. So it's a very and not only the pandemic, also the ecological issues are really much impacting on them.
Mm-hmm. Another question, are you aware of other residency histories or studies regarding other parts of the world outside of the West? It's a really important question.
That's kind of really good question, and it's really interesting. But I know that there is a Spanish pausata who has written about the mobility of in Northern Africa, and he has just left his dissertation to the university, and I think it's a really great opening of looking for alternative histories or narratives of for the residencies. The problem in it is not in Pau's work, but in general, that in different parts of the world, we have all had a kind of own history of art, how we recognize what is art and how the institutions has been formed. And it looks that the type of the residency which we have, it has been exactly in the Western institutional context.
Yeah.
How it developed in the 19th century. But I believe, and also I have to say that also from the European point of view, which is also interesting, that there are also other histories which are really unexplored. For instance, the history of art colonies of ex-Yugoslavia, where a kind of network of state-run artist colonies were part of the state policy. But that's kind of, there are many white spots which really kind of would be interesting to know more. But I believe that there are coming more and more new angles and new in researches on these issues. And I'm sure that somebody who's listening now to us knows something which is not can.
And to add to that, our next panel this afternoon has speakers running residencies in Palestine and Morocco, and tomorrow we have a residency participating from Taiwan and also from Colombia. So there are speakers in the next 2 days of this symposium that have a non-Western perspective, and it's important that we hear from them.
Yeah, I hope that in fact the pandemic also kind of gives kind of a good start for a more equal artist exchanges and so on. They would be really important.
I think
for many artists who come from countries or areas where their working conditions are not so good as in United States or European, the residencies are almost the only one where they can meet and discuss their artwork in a meaningful way. So, and also on the other hand, they also impact back to where they come, and residencies are very good platform for the exchange.
Yes. And we have time for one more question. And before I ask that question, I should say there are quite a few. There are many questions we will not have the time to answer. And I'm sorry for that. And quite a few of them focus on funding. That's not so much the focus of this panel, but if anyone has specific questions, they can write to Rethinking Residencies, and we're happy to ask them. So the last question, you are the founder of HIAP, a residency program in Helsinki. Can you speak, in the few minutes we have, because I know that there's a much longer answer to this question, can you speak about the inception of that program and what led you to begin it, and how has it changed over the years in tandem with the development of residencies?
Yeah, so HIAP started in 1996 by forming, by a kind of idea. I was working then as a producer, and I worked a lot with experimental theater and dancers and visual artists. And I noticed that that in Finland we don't have an international program that would be possible to bring artists to work on site in Helsinki. And we had the Nordic Arts Center, but as we know, it was directed to more to Nordic regions, not to Finland. And so this is why it was the need of the contemporary artist practices, and it was also the need to connect Helsinki-based artists to artists coming from elsewhere. So it was a really fantastic time to start the residency program in a kind of very modest way with 3 studios and not so much money, but much of energy. Helsinki-based artists were very strongly involved into the program. They were really nice. It was a great time. Then HIAP is today in Suomenlinna, and it's running the former studios of the Nordic Arts Center. It has much more space. It started with 3 studios. Now it has around 9-10 studios, 2 in Cable Factory and 8 in the Suomenlinna Island. And it's going well, very well. The director Juha Huuskonen is running it in a fantastic way. And there is a new generation of artists who are also actively, local artists who are actively participating to the programming and participating also to the strategic planning. So the connection to the artist in Helsinki, but also in Finland, is really strong. And it's also is making building new connections, for instance, to residencies in Russia at the moment, which is really interesting. There are many residency programs in Russia, and they are new are coming. So also to Asia, and so has happened. It has very strongly also taken consideration of the ecology by in practice, on practical level, in paying attention how artists are traveling to Finland and back, rather with slow traveling than flying, and also they have a concrete program on how to maintain the residencies and studios in a more ecological way.
Right. Thank you, Irmeli, so much. You're such a wealth of information and knowledge about residencies, and I think we're also lucky to have been able to hear from you today. Thank you. Thank you. So we are now going to see a video. It's almost like a segue into what we were talking about. We're going to see a video on the environment in residencies, which was recorded by Rethinking Residencies members Eileen Jeng Lynch, Curator of Visual Arts, and Gabriel de Guzman, Director of Arts and Chief Curator, both at Wave Hill. This video will last about 3 minutes. After this, we will break for about 25 minutes until 3:30 p.m. when we begin our second session of the day. You can stay on the link. You don't need to go anywhere. After the video, there'll be a slideshow on in rotation until we come back live at 3:30 for the afternoon panel. So thank you all so much.
Hello, I'm Gabriel de Guzman, Director of Arts and Chief Curator at Wave Hill.
Hello, I'm Eileen Jane Lynch, Curator of Visual Arts at Wave Hill.
So Eileen, in a few short weeks, we'll be starting our winter workspace program, It's Hard to Believe, and we'll be converting our gallery spaces into studios, which is very exciting.
It sure is. Residencies can play such a large part of an artist's practice. The environment can inform an artist's experience, either directly or indirectly, as they reflect on their time and continue to make work.
And the setting of an environment, let's say a natural landscape like Wave Hill or Shandaken at Storm King or Wave Farm, these residencies provide artists with so much to take in. I really think that close observation is key. Here, artists will notice not only sweeping views, but also the minute details of plants, like their distinct patterns or nuances of shape and color. Artists might use discarded organic materials in their work, let's say, and Wave Hill has both natural and urban aspects to our site. All of that will certainly play a role in the work that they're making. Also, the community of artists is very important. There are cohorts and they lead to fruitful discussions as well as relationship building.
Definitely, and there are so many different types of residencies. In contrast to here, there are urban sites, such as a demolition waste recycling hub, or more rural areas, such as a farm or remote island for one artist at a time. But what is the environmental impact of residencies and production of art objects? Organizations and artists' concerns with ecological issues have led to programs and practices focusing on restoration and sustainability as they look for solutions. Artists collaborate with scientists and biologists, reuse refuse or recycled material, as you had mentioned, or make it a point to use only non-toxic materials. And what about the carbon footprint involved in traveling to residencies all over the world? Is it better to keep a land untouched despite the valuable research and findings? And virtual residencies aren't the same as in-person ones. Some residencies ask artists to focus on their experience rather than create physical objects. How do we reimagine residencies? We're just really scratching the surface with these questions.
We certainly are. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.